In response to the Elk Grove Police Department's critical incident video released last week, the Mastagny-Holstead law firm obtained the services of use of force expert Sean McCann. He will be reviewing the video of the events on June 5, 2019 at Burlington Coat Factory, as well as additional facts that the community was not provided with.
The totality of the circumstances is a relatively simple but often overlooked concept. It is one that is both employed by officers in their contacts and by DAs in their reviews.
It's a great term, and it's a human term. And what it tells a district attorney and what it tells a law enforcement officer is taking everything into consideration, given everything in that situation that you are aware of at that time.
That means all the facts known to the officer, all the facts surrounding the situation, everything leading up to it, and every single fact that the officer was confronted with at that moment. We're going to take all that into consideration.
The second part of the definition of totality of the circumstances refers to the officer and subject conduct prior to the use of deadly force. This may raise questions regarding how long prior to the use of force is the conduct considered.
The way I interpret that, the conduct of the officer, is how the officer is conducting themselves during that event.
We're going to look at everything that the suspect did leading up to the use of deadly force. But we're also going to look at everything the officer did. One of the things that I do when I look at these cases is I want to know what dispatch said to the officer as the officer is approaching the scene, right? So to me, that takes into account what the officer knows, what the officer says, what the officer did leading up to this encounter that led to someone's death.
Other facts to consider when determining the reasonableness of force is what the officers knew on their way to the call before they interact with a suspect. As we heard earlier, the district attorneys noted that dispatch records communicate information to law enforcement on their way to a call. In this case, the officers knew that they were trying to steal items and were assaulting the security officers. They knew that one and then the other had walked out of Burlington Coat Factory and later came back in throwing up gang signs. Additional critical information was communicated to the officers while they were en route. The reporting party said that one person went outside and they couldn't see if there was a vehicle. That when they came back inside, it was still physical, meaning they're still fighting with the security officers. They were locking the doors and there were customers inside. This poses a huge risk of safety to the public. They also noted that the security officers were not able to get away from the suspects. And most importantly, the reporting party stated that the suspects went out to the trunk of the vehicle and it was unknown if they had weapons inside the vehicle. As you saw in the video earlier with the district attorneys, they described the new definition under California's new law of the totality of the circumstances. Part of that analysis includes not just the officer's conduct before the incident, but the suspect's conduct and some of the suspect's background that may be relevant to show their state of mind at the time they interacted with law enforcement. In this case, suspect Mendoza's criminal history includes multiple gun and assault weapons charges. 2017 and 2018, he was arrested multiple times for assault weapons charges and deadly weapons with a firearm on a person's charges. Some additional facts to consider when analyzing the eventual use of force is the conduct of the suspect and suspects in this case prior to their interaction with law enforcement. Here we can see Mr. Maka in the black shirt and tan pants attempting to steal merchandise and 3 loss prevention officers attempting to stop him. It soon becomes violent as Mr. Maka assaults one of the loss prevention officers right there. Then Mr. Mendoza in the black tank top squares off against the loss prevention officers and a fight ensues. We can see Mr. Mendoza is struck 2 or 3 times in the face, falls to the ground, and is then kneed in the face by one of the loss prevention officers. Both men then continue their assault. Because the Elk Grove police chief did not disclose all the facts, here are all the facts. These facts will be presented to you from an expert, Sean McCann. His expertise is in use of force, arrest, search, and seizure. He has extensive history as a police officer dating back to 1998 with the Berkeley Police Department. He is post-certified as an instructor in arrest and control, weaponless defense, certified human factors and threat and error management, course review specialized subject arrest and control, as well as a certified scenario evaluator. Expert McCann will be relying upon the video the chief provided, the facts contained in this video, which are publicly available. However, the way he differs from a member of the general public is his extensive experience as both a police officer and one who teaches police officers how to do their job.
As we learned earlier in this presentation, use of force analysis includes what's called the totality of the facts and circumstances known to the officer at the time. So essentially, what information did the officer have that affected their decision making? In this case, Officer Schmidt is learning various things on his approach to the crime scene. Any reasonable officer should be considering this information when deciding what force to use, how much, and when. Of particular note, in regard to those facts and circumstances, is the nature of this crime itself. The two suspects weren't merely attempting to steal from the store. They were engaged in a violent struggle while inside with those loss prevention officers. They exit the store during that struggle, and typically what you would think you would see would be the suspects to flee. At that point, they've clearly engaged in crimes. The cops are clearly coming. It's time to run. But in this case, these two suspects apparently return to a vehicle momentarily and then re-enter the store. For for an officer, that kind of behavior is extremely troubling. The logical assumption with that kind of behavior is that the suspects were retrieving weapons to potentially use inside the store should the struggle not go their way. And so we see here, as Officer Schmidt arrives on scene, the first two officers are out on gun. They've challenged the suspects with their firearms. The first suspect has followed commands and laid down on the pavement. The second suspect is reluctant, slow to comply. Now, Officer Schmidt, one of the things that hadn't come out on the radio yet, one of the facts and circumstances he was unaware of as he approached, was the fact that the officers were out on gun, and Officer Schmidt is now arriving essentially downrange from the officers. So he needs to exit his vehicle. You'll see him move up the left side of the screen. He's paying attention. He's focused on the one individual who's still not complying, as well as the other two officers who are focused on that individual. Now we see the suspect prone out. So he has followed the commands that the first officers were giving to have him get on the ground. What he's not doing, though, the commands which he isn't following, are the ones that are telling him to take his hands away from his waistband, away from his sides, to put him out to his sides, kind of like an airplane. The reason for that is if the suspects did in fact retrieve weapons, the area most likely for those weapons to be contained and concealed on the person is in the waistband and the pockets. And so that second suspect, his hands being there near his pockets and his waistband, he has access to any weapons that might be there. The officers at this point are in a very problematic, very difficult situation. It's really rather untenable. They can't get the suspect verbally into the position they need to approach safely. So they have to approach a very dangerous situation. Obviously, none of the officers are willing to actually use deadly force at this moment. They haven't seen any weapons, but they have to be very cognizant of the fact that this could almost, in a split second, become a deadly force scenario. And in such a case, they really can't put their handgun away. They can't reholster their firearm and go up there and go hands-on very easily until they get those hands away from the waistband. So the cover officer, Officer Schmidt in this case, will be the one who makes the approach. Now, as he approaches, you see the suspect's head come up off of the ground. That is a danger signal to the officer. The threat posed by those hands being near the waistband is now amplified by the suspect looking around. In order to engage in a gunfight, essentially, the suspect would need to know where the officers are. It's called target acquisition, or visually acquiring targets. That appears to be what the suspect is doing in this case. The cover officer, Officer Schmidt, who's now approached and is relatively close, really doesn't have many options at this point. The suspect isn't following the verbal commands, so those won't work. The officer is too close now to turn around and try to retreat. If the suspect were to deploy a firearm, the officer would have no cover. And so the only thing that the officer has free at this point are his feet. And so you're going to see the officer address the threats with his feet. That first threat being the head and the visual acquisition of the officers by the suspect. The Officer Schmidt, the cover officer, is going to use a push kick type maneuver to redirect that head away from the officers. And then you're going to see him employ kicks to move the hands away from the waistband. Again, his feet are really truly the only thing he has free. Until he can address those threats, he's not going to be able to safely grab the suspect. So, we'll continue watching.
George 5-1, we have two, one not compliant, one not compliant. Copy, non-compliant.
Now there you saw, again, the kicks to the hands to move them away. The right hand moved back toward the waistband again. And mind you, most people are right-handed. At which point the cover officer used a final kick to again knock that hand away. Then the first officer managed to make contact and started taking the suspect into custody. He's applying a handcuff to one hand. Now you're going to see, now that those hands are no longer the same level of threat, and one is already cuffed, you're going to see the cover officer, Officer Schmidt, helping in terms of completing that handcuffing. You also notice that as that threat level is reduced, the force being used is reduced. And once the handcuffing is completed, none of the officers are using force. That's all consistent with a reasonable force approach.